tomorrow morning, unless Hamas or some other terrorist actor derails the deal, the first 3 hostages, dead or alive, we don't know, are going to be returned into Israel from Gaza. 3 of the 33, again, dead or alive, we don't know.
Right.
Now, democracies always say they don't negotiate with terrorists, and yet that is what Israel, with the pressure or support, depending on how you see it, of the United States, that is what they've just done. Because in exchange for these 33, of course, there's going to be more than 1,000 Palestinian terrorists, murderers, people in Israeli prisons are going to be released. Is this a good strategy?
So I have candidly mixed sentiments on the deal. Let's start with the top line. Hostages being released, that is unequivocally good. That is cause for celebration. Every hostage needs to be released, and we will celebrate every Israeli hostage who is released, every American hostage who is released, and that is a very good thing. The precise contours of the deal are still not entirely clear. I do worry about, number one, the terrorists that are going to be released from jail as part of this deal. And I worry about 6 months from now, those terrorists murdering additional people. I also worry about Hamas remaining in power in Gaza. I think that is an enormous problem. And so, where we are right now, I am cautiously watching what plays out. Now, we shouldn't be here. This occurred because of catastrophic failures from the Biden White House. I don't believe October 7th happens if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are not in the White House. And so, moving forward...
Say more about that, because I mean, people know how I feel about Israel, regardless of how I feel about the government. But how can you not blame the Israeli government for hubris or, believing somehow that being the startup nation and the high-tech superpower would prevent the, crossing over the border by people, paragliders and trucks? How is that not a failure of the Israeli government? Why is it more Biden and Kamala's fault?
Because the United States is the indispensable nation in the world. And when you have a strong president and a strong commander-in-chief, our enemies are afraid. And when you have a weak president and a weak commander-in-chief, our enemies are emboldened. And I think over 4 years, what we've seen, number one, Joe Biden, for 4 years, our friends and allies don't trust us, and our enemies don't fear us. Rewind to the disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan. That was catastrophic on multiple levels, but one of the consequences, and something I said publicly at the time, I said the chances of Russia invading Ukraine have just risen tenfold. Because every enemy of America is looking to the Oval Office, taking the measure of the man in the Oval Office, and they've determined that the American commander-in-chief is weak. Hamas was emboldened by that. Hezbollah was emboldened by that. Iran was emboldened by that. Number two, Joe Biden and this administration remains the most anti-Israel administration we have ever seen. They systematically came in from day one and began undermining the government of Israel. And not only doing that, but they began supporting the enemies of Israel. And if you look at Iran, Iran is the head of the snake. Joe Biden is responsible for flowing over $100 billion to Iran. You may have seen when I've cross-examined Tony Blinken as Secretary of State and tried to hold him to account. Kamala Harris said on, I think it was 60 Minutes, that Iran is the greatest threat to America. And what's astonishing, because the corporate media no longer behaves like journalists, they didn't ask the follow-up question, well, if they're the most dangerous enemy to America, why the hell did you give them $100 billion? That's not a subtle question. It's not a complicated question.
But you think Biden White House vis-a-vis Israel worse than the Obama White House?
Much more so. Not even close. Look, some of it is the Democrat Party has moved. So many of the people are the same people. It's the same Obama folks that were undermining Israel, but they're operating in the context of a Democrat Party where anti-Semitism is normalized, where hatred of Israel is a significant part of the Democrat Party today. And so, all right, let's take, for example, October 7th. On the night of October 7th, the State Department sent out a tweet from the Office of Palestinian Affairs that said Israel must not respond. There must be no military reaction whatsoever. This is while the death squads are still murdering people. It was 3 in the morning here in the United States when they sent that tweet out. My team and I saw that tweet at 3 in the morning. We responded immediately with, this is reprehensible. Whoever wrote this tweet should be fired. Within minutes, they deleted the tweet. Now, you might say, okay, that's a rogue staffer within the Office of Palestinian Affairs. The next day, October 8th, Tony Blinken, from his own Twitter account, sent out a tweet the next day. He said, I just got off the phone with the Turkish foreign minister. We agreed Israel must not respond, must not retaliate. There should be no military response whatsoever. This is less than 24 hours after Hamas has murdered 1,200 civilians. Again, I called that out. Again, they deleted that tweet. At every level since October 7th, the Biden White House position has been stop killing the terrorists. What I believe American foreign policy should be is we stand unequivocally with Israel. And Israel is right in its commitment to utterly destroy Hamas. And also that Israel has decimated Hezbollah as well. Hezbollah put up its hand and said, we want to be part of this as well. They may be regretting that, although I think everyone who made that decision is no longer with us. So that's a significant improvement.
Biden and Trump have both claimed credit for this deal. The person who seemingly pulled off this deal is a real estate developer from the Bronx with no experience in the Middle East. Who deserves credit? Is it Steve Witkoff? Is it Donald Trump? Is it the fact that Donald Trump put out that tweet saying there was going to be, paraphrasing here, maybe not by much, there's going to be hell to pay if the hostages aren't released by inauguration? Who deserves credit?
Listen, this deal doesn't happen without Donald Trump. If it's just the Biden administration, there's a reason this hasn't happened for a year and 4 months since October 7th. It is because Trump is coming in, is because of his comment they'll be held to pay that was the impetus for this deal. So I'm glad of it. I will celebrate every hostage who is released. And this is something I've foreshadowed for some time, that I believed we would see a release of hostages reminiscent of in 1981 when Reagan was being sworn in and Iran released our hostages on January 20th, on the day Reagan was sworn in. So I think the Trump effect is very real. But I don't think this deal puts everything behind us. And I do think it is critically important that America stand with Israel going forward. And in particular, I expect continued bad action from Hamas. And if and when Israel finds it necessary to respond to that continued bad action, I am confident, I believe America will stand with Israel in doing so. I can tell you this week, I spent day before yesterday about 45 minutes on the phone with Prime Minister Netanyahu, talking about the challenges they're facing, and they're very concerned about what Hamas is going to do in the days and weeks ahead. That concern is right and understandable, and I think it's important that America have Israel's back going forward.
The narrative around people kind of close to the deal was Bibi was just squeezed by Trump and by Witkoff. He had to do what they said because he's thrown in his lot entirely with the GOP and with Trump. Yes. True?
Look, there's no doubt that the Trump team wanted a deal, and they were pressing hard for a deal. If and when hostages come home, that is a good thing. So I will celebrate that. In terms of assessing the rest of the deal, we're not going to know until some time rolls forward.
Okay, one last question on the deal. I have been shocked to discover, it was just not a place I was looking, but the more I've looked, the more shocking the picture becomes over the role of Qatar. Not just in this deal, but how much influence they have over U.S. foreign policy and other, frankly, other key institutions in American life. In the case of this deal, we essentially outsourced the negotiation to Doha, where the leaders of Hamas live.
Yep.
Explain this to me. How has this been allowed to happen? How is this not a scandal? Is Qatar a legitimate ally here? Like, explain the role of Qatar and why this has been such an overlooked aspect of American foreign policy right now.
Listen, I think we need absolute clarity when it comes to Qatar, and Qatar has repeatedly gotten in bed with enemies of America and has supported enemies of America and supported enemies of Israel. I've introduced legislation that would sanction Qatar back to the Stone Age. So my view on this is not complicated. By the way, to be clear, the Qatari government has also paid for spies to personally surveil me, so they understand exactly where I stand on this issue. My view in terms of my view of foreign countries comes down to one simple thing. Are you our friend or our enemy? Are you behaving like our friend or are you behaving like our enemy? I believe in clarity. And let's step back for a second. You and I have both followed foreign policy and Middle East foreign policy for a long, long time. If you look at the first Trump administration, particularly by the end of the first Trump term, we saw peace flowering in the Middle East in a way that had not happened in either of our lifetimes.
Totally.
A rational and reasonable person would engage in some introspection to say, okay, well, what changed? Why suddenly are we seeing the Abraham Accords? Why are we seeing Arabs and Israelis coming together? And I think there's a reason, which is historically the enlightened view in Washington about the Middle East in particular, is that you should have deliberate and studied ambiguity. That what America gives with one hand, it takes away with the other. And we saw this from Democrat administrations and sadly a lot of Republican administrations. They'd say, oh, a little bit of Israel, a little bit of the Palestinians, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And that ambiguity, all of the graybeards in Washington said was the smart approach. I have to tell you, I've always thought that was an imbecilic approach.
But don't you think we have exactly that ambiguity vis-a-vis Qatar right now?
I hope not. And I will say this. So let's rewind to Trump term one, because to be clear, Donald Trump hasn't been sworn in yet for the second term, so it's a bit early to render judgments on what the foreign policy will be for the next 4 years. But in Trump term one, I will tell you the two most important foreign policy decisions, I believe, were number one, the decision to move the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, and number two, the decision to pull out of the disastrous Obama-Iran nuclear deal. On both of those decisions, there were battles within the Trump administration, big, serious battles. On moving the embassy to Jerusalem, both state and defense opposed that. Rex Tillerson and Jim Mattis argued vociferously that doing so would inflame the enemies of Israel and the enemies of America. I tell you, I went to the Oval a dozen times or more arguing for moving the embassy and pointing out the enemies of Israel already hate us. And the right approach is not this studied ambiguity, but draw a line in the sand and say, we stand with Israel unequivocally. President Trump agreed with me, overruled his own Secretary of State, his own Secretary of Defense. Same thing on the Iran nuclear deal. Both state and defense opposed pulling out of that deal. I probably went 24 times to the Oval to make the case that we needed to pull out of the deal. Again, Trump agreed with me, overruled state and defense. Those decisions, fast forward to the Abraham Accords. I was on the South Lawn of the White House when the Abraham Accords were signed. In that week, I spoke with the foreign minister and ambassadors from UAE and Bahrain. They both said almost word for word the same thing. They said, we want to be friends with America. We now understand that America stands unequivocally with Israel. Therefore, we will be friends with Israel. That's the power of clarity. That's what produced the peace. Joe Biden came in and immediately returned to the studied ambiguity, undermining Israel. And I think that is a major part of what produced October 7th.
I want to ask you a question about the airlines flying to Israel, and then we'll move on to other topics. I want to talk about China and the TikTok Supreme Court decision, which seems really important right now. There are currently no American airlines, no U.S. airlines flying to Israel right now, and they haven't been for months.
Yes.
The airlines claim it's because of safety and ongoing conflict in the region. You say it's because of anti-Semitism. What's the real story?
Look, I think they need to resume the flights. I think U.S. airlines need to resume flights to Israel. We have El Al that has flights. We have regional airlines in the Middle East, in Europe, that are having flights go in and out. And I think it is politics that is driving that decision rather than their stated concerns. I'll point out...
Politics on the part of the unions?
Yes. In particular, you look at the flight attendant union that has been very vocally anti-Israel and, in fact, has supported the anti-Semitic protests on college campuses. And... listen, I'm the incoming chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee that has jurisdiction over, among other things, it has jurisdiction over 40% of the U.S. economy, including aviation.
So what can be done?
A lot can be done. I think this will be fixed.
Give us a little preview. What can be done?
A lot can be done, but going back to drawing a line in the sand.
Come on.
I'm going to predict within 30 days they'll resume flights.
Okay.
I think clarity has enormous power. And there are too many people in politics that don't speak clearly. By the way, my hope is, let's take Iran. My hope is that on January 20th, this policy of appeasement towards Iran ends immediately and we see a return to maximum pressure. And again, let's rewind to Trump 1 because this is important. All right, so after we pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, there were a whole series of waivers that remained in place that left bad policies in place. The most important of which was an oil waiver that gave Iran a waiver from sanctions to allow it to sell oil. Now, oil is the principal source of revenue for the Iranian government. And so after Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, I began leading the fight to end the oil waivers. Now, in this instance, there was a different fight within the Trump administration. It was a fight between state and energy. So Mike Pompeo has started as the new Secretary of State. State's position, at the time, Iran was selling roughly 1 million barrels a day of oil. State's position was if you end the oil waivers, the price of oil will skyrocket globally. That'll raise the price of gasoline at home, so do not end the oil waivers. The Department of Energy, which you might think would know something about energy, said that's ridiculous. There's plenty of global supply of oil. You can end the oil waivers and it's not going to impact the price. I engaged vigorously again and said end the oil waivers now. Again, Trump agreed with me, so we overruled state. And we now know the answer, which is state was wrong and energy was right. We ended the oil waivers. Iran's oil sales plummeted, and the price of oil didn't move globally. It had no effect on gasoline here at home. But for Iran, their sales fell from 1 million barrels a day to, at the end of the Trump administration, to 300,000 barrels a day. The consequence, the Iranian economy was in shambles. The regime was teetering. I think it was near collapse. Joe Biden came in and, riding a white horse to the rescue of the Ayatollah, immediately began enforcing the oil sanctions. Today, Iran is selling 2 million barrels a day of oil. They went from 300,000 barrels a day of oil to 2 million barrels a day of oil. That is over $80 billion. And understand, Iran provides 90% of the funding to Hamas and 90% of the funding to Hezbollah. In a very real sense, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were the funders behind the terrorists who carried out October 7th. My hope is on January 20th, in 2 days, the oil sanctions are enforced again, and I want to see Iranian oil exports plummet again to ideally below 300,000 so that we starve the snake and cut off the head of the snake.